غرباء 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 ولغير الله لا نحمل الجباه غرباء.
إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا. من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له، وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. أما بعد, in the last lesson, the last division we looked at was al-Hadith al-Mudallas. In today's lesson we are going to be looking at al-Hadith al-Maqlub, starting from al-Hadith al-Shadh and al-Maqlub, among others, starting from the 21st line, where the author he says فالشاذ والمقلوب قسمان تلا وما يخالف ثقة به الملا فالشاذ والمقلوب قسمان تلا إبدال راو ما براو قسم وقلب إسناد لمتن قسم. So we are discussing al-Hadith al-Shadh, and this terminology al-Shadh, although is very popular as a term we use in describing a hadith, is not very common in its usage when we go back to the earlier scholars and we are reading through their works. Rather, what we find to be most common is al-Hadith al-Munkar. But given that this is a beginner book, it's okay that we discuss it as though it were the case that it is common. So he says al-Hadith وَمَا يُخَالِفْ ثِقَةٌ بِهِ الْمَلَا فَالشَّاذُ وَالْمَقْلُوبُ قِسْمَانِ تَلَا. And also that what the term is describing actually exists. So is in terms of only the terminology we are saying, it's not very common, but regards what it is describing, it is very common. So he says وَمَا يُخَالِفْ ثِقَةٌ بِهِ الْمَلَا. In a narration where a reliable narrator contradicts al-mala, a group of narrators. So al-mala here means a group of narrators who are more reliable, obviously, if we consider the number. So we have one reliable narrator being contradicted or contradicting other more reliable narrators. In fact, even if they were in the same level of reliability, except that in the number, okay, so we have 3 reliable narrators, 2 reliable narrators would definitely be more than one of them. It says for shadh, when this scenario happens, such a hadith is called shadh. We have one narrator who is reliable narrating a hadith in a way that contradicts a more reliable narrator, then this hadith is said to be shadh. And then he says well maqlūbu qismani tala, and al hadith is said to be maqlūb. Okay, and he's going to describe it, but he starts off by saying that it's divided into 2. But in general, al-maqlūb comes from the term al-qalb. Al-maqlūb comes from the term al-qalb, which means a change, a tabdil. Okay, when there's a change. Okay, ma ubdila fi sanadihi aw matnihi lafzun bi akhar, when the chain or some word in the text itself, in the matn itself, is changed with another, then we say there is qalb. So when this happens, we say such a hadith is maqlub. Then he says فَالْمَقْلُوبُ قِسْمَانِ تَلَا, there are 2 divisions of maqlub as described below. إِبْدَالُ رَاوٍ مَا بِرَاوٍ قِسْمُ, when a narrator is changed with another narrator, this one division. And this is called qalb al-isnad, as is called the other one, وَقَلْبُ إِسْنَادٍ لِمَتْنٍ قِسْمُ. And when an entire matn, when an entire sanad is changed for another matn. So there are 2 ahadiths. There's this matn, there's this isnad. Then we change their matn and isnad. So the hadith A is matn. Hadith A isnad is given to hadith B's matn. Okay, hadith A's sanad is given to hadith B's matn. The chain of hadith A is given to the matn of hadith B. Then we say this is also qalb. So he says there are 2 forms. There's also qalb in the matn when there is a change in the matn. In that sense, we could say maybe there are 2 or even more, depending on how the change has happened. But in any case, he says ibdalu rawi ma bi rawin qismu, when a narrator is changed for another. So let's say we have a narrator called Sinan bin Sa'ad and he's changed for Sa'ad bin Sinan, or Murra bin Ka'b is changed for Ka'b bin Murra. then this is said to be qalbu rawin birawin. A narrator is changed for another. And when an entire sanad is transferred onto another hadith, this is also another division of al-maqlub. And in the 23rd line, he describes al-hadith al-fard. وَالْفَرْدُ مَا قَيَّدْتَهُ بِثِقَةِ أَوْ جَمْعٍ أَوْ قَصْرٍ عَلَى رِوَايَةٍ. So he says a hadith is said to be fard. Hadith is said to be fard if it has just one narrator. مَا قَيَّدْتَهُ بِثِقَةٍ. If it has just one narrator at any level in its sanad, then we say such a hadith is fard. Okay. أَوْ جَمْعٍ أَوْ قَصْرٍ عَلَى رِوَايَةٍ. He says, well, it's not limited to when we have only one narrator at any level. It could be a number of narrators, but they are such that they have a peculiar feature. So let's say all the narrators in the hadith are of a particular denizen, of a particular country. Okay, then we say this is hadithun shamiyun, like we said in the beginning when we described al-hadith al-hasan, that a hadith can be described with the cities of the narrators. And so when we have all the narrators of a particular level being from a particular city, then we say this hadith is hadith of a particular country. Tafarrada bihi ahlu Hijaz masalan. Okay, in Sunan Abi Dawud there's a hadith number 2348, and in Sunan At-Tirmidhi as well, hadith number 705. From is recorded through Mulazim bin Amr and Abdillah bin Nu'man. حدثني قيس بن طلق عن أبيه قال قال صلى الله عليه وسلم كلوا واشربوا ولا يهيدنكم الساتع المسعد فكلوا واشربوا حتى يعترض لكم الأحمر. This hadith is talking about sahur. Okay, Abu Dawood, after he recorded this hadith, said تفرد به. He says, هذا مما تفرد به أهل اليمامة. This hadith is single-handedly narrated by the people of Yamama. Here he does not mean that, it could mean there's just one narrator at every level, but this is not the most obvious meaning. The most obvious meaning is all the narrators are from this particular city. So this hadith is unique to this city. It's unique to al-Yamama. Okay, if you read the biographies of all the narrators, you would realize that they are all Yamamiyun, they are all from Yamama. And so he says this is ما تفرد به جمع. ما تفرد به جمع. So we have ما تفرد به ثقة is at a particular level, there's only one narrator. This is fard. Only one narrator has recorded it. In here he says the narrator is ثقة, is reliable. It could also be that he is ضعيف. أو جمع أو قصر على رواية, or is recorded by the people of a particular city. It doesn't matter if it's is solitary on every level. It doesn't matter if it's solitary on every level. What matters is that all the narrators are from a particular city, for example. And then there's التفرد المقيد بالقصر أو قصر على رواية. Okay, when a particular narrator among several others records it. Okay. تفرد الراوي بالحديث عن راوي لا يرويه عنه غيره. So you say تفرد به فلان وقد يكون مرويا من طرق عن غيره. So the hadith could be recorded through other narrators, except with a particular narrator there's just one narrator. So let's say we have, say, the hadith of Talq bin Ghannam, حدثنا عبد السلام بن حرب الملائي عن فضيل بن ميسرة عن أبي الجوزاء عن عائشة قال كان الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم إذا استفتح الصلاة قال سبحانك اللهم بحمدك وتبارك اسمك وتعالى جدك لا إله غيرك. Abu Dawud, he says وهذا الحديث, this found in Sunan Abi Dawud, hadith number 776. After recording this hadith, Abu Dawud, he says وهذا الحديث ليس بالمشهور عن عبد السلام بن حرب ولم يرويه إلا طلق بن غنام. Now the hadith is popular, it has other chains, but the narration of Abdul Salam bin Harb is not common. He says لا يرويه لم يرويه إلا طلق بن غنام. It only Talq bin Ghannam who narrates through Abdul Salam bin Harb. The hadith is popular through other narrators, but then Talq bin Ghannam, he comes and he narrates through As-Salam bin Harb, and As-Salam bin Harb is not known to have narrated it. Okay. وقد روى قصة الصلاة عن بديل جماعة لم يذكروا فيه شيئا من هذا. Now this hadith is popular. Several other narrators have narrated it, But as a narration of Salam bin Harb al-Mula'i, this is not common. The only person who narrates it this way is Talq bin Ghannam. Therefore, this is fardun yani muqassar ala rawin ma. So this is also another division of al-hadith al-fard. So we've looked at al-hadith al-shadh, al-hadith al-maqlub, and al-hadith al-fard. The next one in the 24th length is in the 24th line is al-hadith al-mu'all or al-hadith al-mu'allal. So he says وَمَا بِعِلَّةٍ غُمُودٍ أَوْ خَفَى مُعَلَّلٌ عِنْدَهُمْ قَدْ عُرِفَ. وَمَا بِعِلَّةٍ غُمُودٍ أَوْ خَفَى, that any hadith that has a difficult to discover, and if a defect that is difficult to discover, يعني إلا غمود, illa that is very difficult to cover. And I'm translating this as difficult to discover because he said aw khafa, so I could have easily said yani ghumudi, what is hidden, but then he says aw khafa, and khafa means it's hidden, so we need to translate ghumud differently, and so we say it's difficult to discover or it's hidden. And obviously it's difficult to cover because it's hidden. وَمَا بِعِلَّةٍ غُمُودٍ أَوْ خَفَى, any hadith that has a defect that is difficult to discover, or khafa, or it has a defect that is hidden. He says mu'allalun indahu qad urifa. This is called mu'allal according to the hadith scholars, and this is called mu'all or mu'allal or ma'lul. Okay, all are three common terms, with some linguists talking about ma'lul not being very linguistic, it's not very lexical, but then mu'all is said to be the most lexical, the most linguistic, the mu'allal and then ma'lul. So when a hadith has a hidden effective defect, we say the hadith has illah. Okay. We can, because of the if I wanted to cite an example, I would have to talk about it in so many details that I might end up not really making it understandable. But suffice to say that hadith would generally be okay. You look at the chain, this is how it comes about. So you pick a hadith, the chain is very sound and everything seems to be okay. But when you begin investigating it further and looking through it, you will come to discover that it has a hidden issue with it. It has a hidden issue. Okay, it could be in the matn or it could be in the sanad, but mostly in the sanad. This is where we find ilal, mostly in the sanad. Okay, so let me just go ahead and give an example. In Sunan Abi Dawud, hadith number 179, in Sunan At-Tirmidhi, hadith number 86, and Sunan Nasa'i, hadith number 170, recorded through Waqi' ibn al-Jarrah from Habib bin Abi Thabit and Urwa and Aisha anna Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam qabbala mar'atan min nisa'i thumma kharaja ila as-salati wa lam yatawadda. The Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he kissed one of his wives and he went out to pray and he did not perform ablution. Now this hadith, the scholar said it has a illah, but when you look through, all the narrators are reliable. Okay, but Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Qattan, the teacher of Imam Hanbal and Co, and Ibn Ma'in, also a student of Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Qattan, and Ali ibn al-Madini, also a student of Ali ibn al-Qattan, and al-Bukhari, a student of all of them, a student of Ibn Ma'in, a student of Ibn al-Madini, a student of Ahmad Hanbal, and at-Tirmidhi, a student of Bukhari, wa Daraqutni, wal Bayhaqi. All of them, they said this hadith has a illah, and the illah is that Habib, okay, ibn Abi Thabit, did not hear this hadith in particular from Urwa. Now Habib was a student of Urwa. Habib bin Abi Thabit was a student of Urwa. Except upon further investigation, it was realized that Habib did not hear this hadith specifically from Urwa. So when he says an Urwa, he does not mean that he studied it directly from Urwa. It doesn't mean that he studied it directly from Urwa. And for this reason, the scholars said this hadith has illah. This hadith has illah. In the 25th line, then he goes on to describe al-hadith al-muttarib wa dhukhtilafi sanadin aw matni muttaribun inda uhayl al-fanni wa dhukhtilafi sanadin aw matni, a hadith that has discrepancies, inconsistencies in its chain or its matn. Muttaribun is called muttaribun inda uhayl al-fanni according to the scholars of the field. Okay, according to the scholars of the field, if there is discrepancies, there is inconsistency in the chain. Okay, and the way it happens is this. So we have a narrator who at best is a backbencher. Okay, I like to give this example of backbenchers in a class. So he's a backbencher, and his students, they narrate. He has about 5 to 10 different students narrating the same hadith from him. And some of the students, and all of them reliable, they say, oh, our teacher said the color of the chair is blue. And others say, nah, it's blue black. And I say it's dark blue. Others say it's magenta. Others say it's it's green. And because all of these students are reliable, it's unlikely that they are making these things up. So what is most probable is the teacher actually narrated it in such confusing ways. At one point he says blue, at another he says dark blue, at another he says blue black, at another he says magenta, and at another he says green. So we realize that all these discrepancies we find in the narrations of his students are coming from him. Then this would be proof enough that he did not particularly pay attention to the hadith when it was being taught to him. So anytime he came to teach it, he would make something up, not deliberately, obviously, but because he was a backbencher, he never paid attention in class. He wasn't really sure what was going on in class, and so every time that he narrated to any student, any group of students, he would narrate differently. Okay, you could akin it to a teacher solving a question on the board, and he solves and he solves and he solves, and he watches and it's like, no. Then he cleans, and then he tries to solve again, and he goes to a conclusion. He compares with his paper, and he doesn't get the answer. When this happens to the teacher a lot, you would realize that this teacher, he did not revise his notes before coming. So when all the narrators are narrating it in confusing and inconsistent ways, we know that the teacher did not particularly pay attention in class, and he did not revise before he came to class. And we would say the teacher has ittirab. We say the teacher has ittirab. And then also in the 26th line, he talks about al-hadith al-mudraj. Al-hadith al-mudraj. He says, وَالْمُدْرَجَاتُ فِي الْحَدِيثِ مَا أَتَتْ مِنْ بَعْضِ أَلْفَاظِ الرُّوَاةِ التَّصَلَةِ. Hadith is said to be mudraj. Okay. وَالْمُدْرَجَاتُ فِي الْحَدِيثِ مَا أَتَتْ. Hadith, mudraj in hadith is مَا أَتَتْ min ba'di alfaz al-ruwati tasalat, any narration that has some words of the narrators being raised to the level of the Prophet, being raised to being included in the hadith itself. Okay, so Ibn Hajar he says it's damju mawqufin bimarfu'in. Damju mawqufin bimarfu'in. When a statement of a narrator, whether a sahabi or a tabi'i, is mixed with a marfu', a statement of Prophet ﷺ, we say it is mudraj. A statement of some narrators is mixed with the statement of Prophet ﷺ. Often this happens for several reasons, including explanation. Okay, so the narrator is mentioning a hadith and he comes across a word he believes is hard to understand. Then he explains it. Would have been explicit that this is explanation, or maybe he's explicit, but the students who are later narrating the hadith, they didn't pay attention, and so they assume that this explanation of their teacher was part of the hadith, and so they narrate it as such. This is said to be mudraj. This is said to be mudraj. Okay, the commonest example is the hadith of waylun lil aqabi min an-nar, recorded in Sahih Bukhari. Okay, recorded in Sahih Bukhari and Muslim. And in some narrations, like Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, he recorded in Al-Fasl al-Wasl al-Mudraj fi al-Naql, Abu Hurairah at one point he says, Asbighul wudu'a waylun lil aqabi min an-nar. So Abu Hurairah, he starts off the hadith by saying, Asbighul wudu, perfect your ablution, waylun lil aqabi min an-nar, woe unto the heels that are not washed in ablution. Now, later, some of his students, when they narrated this hadith, they did not distinguish between Abu Hurairah's statement, Asbiqul wudu, from the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and they will narrate it as one hadith, Asbiqul wudu, waylun lil aqabi minan nar. And so this statement, Asbiqul wudu, that is entered into the hadith, is said to be mudraj. And in our next lesson, we'll be looking at al-hadith al-mudabbash. Subhanakallahumma bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.